This video tells the stories of 7 English queens and princesses who died during childbirth. While modern medicine has transformed childbirth into a far safer experience, in medieval Europe it was a harrowing ordeal. Around a third of women perished during their childbearing years. The mere discovery of pregnancy prompted many to write their wills, a stark reminder of the inherent risks. Obstructed labour, hemorrhaging, and eclampsia were just some of the dangers women faced. Infection posed a particularly potent threat, and without antiseptics, childbirth often led to childbed fever, a deadly infection that struck days after delivery. Adding to the peril held a bewildering misunderstanding of female anatomy. They believed a woman's reproductive organs were merely simply inverted versions of male ones. Royal status offered no sanctuary. In fact, these women faced even greater pressure. Seen as duty-bound to produce heirs, they were expected to have numerous children. Breastfeeding, a natural birth control method, was shunned in favour of wet nurses, allowing the Queen to quickly return to marital duties. Limited access to skilled doctors often meant exposure to harmful, ineffective medical practices. Even a queen's life hung precariously in the balance. Firstly, we have Isabella of England. Isabella, the 4th child of King John, married Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II at the young age of 21. After moving to Germany, she found herself isolated from her homeland. The emperor, who had a history of keeping concubines, added Isabella to his collection. During their 6-year marriage, Isabella bore him 4 or 5 children, but at least one died young. Tragically, Isabella herself died at the young age of 27 while giving birth to a daughter. Next, we have Mary de Bohun. Mary de Bohun was an English noblewoman caught in the middle of the War of Roses. After her father's death, she was kidnapped and forced into a convent. However, she was soon abducted again, this time by John of Gaunt, who married her to his teenage son, Henry. Despite the awkwardness of their young age, Mary quickly became pregnant. Sadly, her first child lived only a few days. Mary went on to have 6 more children, but her own life was cut short at only 26 when she died giving birth to her second daughter, Philippa. Ironically, both of Mary's daughters, Blanche and Philippa, would also die from complications related to childbirth. The death of Isabella of Valois. Isabella of Valois, just 6 years old, was married to the 29-year-old widowed King Richard II of England in 1396, which is considered quite unsettling. She was the daughter of the King of France, Charles VI, and their marriage was primarily a political move to establish peace between England and France. Despite the discomfort of marrying such a young girl, Richard saw it as an opportunity to shape her into his ideal queen. However, they agreed not to consummate their marriage until Isabella turned 12, maintaining some level of decency even in those times. However, 12 today would still not be considered very decent. This was Richard's second marriage, as he had previously been married to Anne of Bohemia, who sadly died in 1394. Isabella was born on the 9th of November 1389 in Paris, France, as the 3rd child and second daughter of Charles VI and the King of France, and his wife, Isabella of Valois. Sadly, her eldest sibling had already passed away before her birth, and the second eldest died the following year. Despite these losses, she had 9 younger siblings, 7 of whom survived infancy. Notably, 5 of her younger siblings were born after she was married off to England, and tragically one of them died while she was still there. In 1396, discussions began about marrying the 6-year-old Isabella to the widowed Richard II, the King of England, who was 22 years her senior, as a means to secure peace between their nations. Although concerns were raised about her age, King Richard argued that time would solve the issue, viewing her youth as an opportunity to mould her into his ideal queen. Isabella, described as pretty by English envoys, expressed her happiness about becoming Queen of England, believing it would elevate her status. She even started preparing for her new role. Richard travelled to Paris to fetch his bride amidst grand celebrations. The festivities continued in Calais, where the wedding ceremony took place on the 31st of October 1396. However, it was agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until Isabella reached her 12th birthday, and Isabella, with a sizable dowry and a suitcase filled with dollies, became Queen of England in 1397. She spent much of her short reign at Windsor Castle. Richard's reign ended tragically when he was deposed in 1399, leaving Isabella in a precarious position. She was placed under house arrest in Berkshire, and her situation worsened when Richard died in 1400. Isabella was, however, still an attraction as a royal spouse, and Henry IV wished to marry her to his son, who was near her own age. That boy would become Henry V, and also the inspiration for the Prince Hal in Shakespearean drama. To Isabella, however, the idea was abhorrent, and she refused to cooperate or even speak at court. She assumed Richard II was dead, which was indeed true by 1400. He'd either been murdered or had died after a self-imposed hunger strike while imprisoned at Pontefract Castle. Isabella's family in France campaigned for her return, but Henry IV would not allow it for several years. Eventually, she was allowed to leave England, and she was married to her cousin. It was in 1401 when she was allowed to return to France without her dowry and her marriage unconsummated. She later married Charles, Duke of Orleans, in 1407 at the age of 16, but she later died during childbirth just 2 years later. Charles Valois, the Duke of Orleans, wed Isabella on the 29th of June. It is said that she didn't want the marriage and that she cried throughout the entire ceremony. Isabella passed away after delivering a daughter in September of 1410, though some sources do suggest that it could have been 1409. Her death occurred in Blois, Anjou, France, when she was either 20 or 21 years old. Queen Isabella of Valois, a mere wisp of a woman at only 20, lay pale and breathless in the opulent chamber of the Blois Chateau. The joy of childbirth, of bringing forth her daughter Joan, had been a flickering candle snuffed out by a sudden, relentless tide of weakness. Her ladies-in-waiting, their faces etched with grief, moved in a hushed ballet, their rich silks whispering against the polished oak floor. The once vibrant light in Isabella's eyes had dimmed, replaced by a heartbreaking stillness. News of the young queen's passing spread like a shroud through the castle, then rippled outward, carried on the wings of ravens to the court of France. A bride at 6, a queen at 7, Isabella's life had been a tapestry woven within the threads of political alliances. Married to King Richard II of England in a desperate attempt to forge peace, she had found herself caught in the machines of powerful men. When Richard was overthrown, Isabella, a pawn no longer of use, was returned to France, a solitary figure burdened by the weight of a crown that she no longer wore. Despite the turmoil of her short life, Isabella had found solace in the promise of motherhood, yet the cruel hand of fate had dealt her a final crushing blow. As the last vestiges of life ebbed away, a single tear traced a glistening path down her cheek, a silent testament to a life unfulfilled, a future stolen by the relentless march of time. Queen Isabella was dead, leaving behind a legacy of youthful beauty and tragic brevity. In a bizarre twist of fate, her second husband was taken hostage by the English after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He remained in captivity for 24 years, spending time composing poetry at various locations, including Pontefract Castle, where Richard II was said to have died. The death of Elizabeth of York, a Tudor tragedy. Elizabeth of York, a woman who embodied the fragile piece stitched together at the end of the Wars of the Roses, breathed her last within the imposing walls of the Tower of London. February 1503 found the Queen heavy with child, a time that had been filled with anticipation. Instead, a sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air, a premonition of the tragedy that would soon unfold. Despite the marriage of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York being a political arrangement, there are records that indicate that both partners appear to have slowly fallen in love with each other. They went on to have 6 children that would survive into adulthood, but the Queen's life would end on the birth of their 7th child. Catherine, the Tower, once a symbol of royal power, now served as Elizabeth's confinement. Gone were the days of vibrant court life, replaced by the cold, unforgiving stone fortress. Here, amidst the ghosts of past monarchs and whispers of treachery, Elizabeth awaited the arrival of her child. A glimmer of hope flickered in the form of a new, luxuriously embroidered bed, its curtains adorned with clouds and roses, a symbol of both heavenly serenity and earthly beauty. On the 2nd of February, a daughter named Katherine entered the world, but the joy of childbirth was short-lived. The frail infant succumbed just days later, leaving a fresh wound upon the Queen's already wary heart. As if fate itself conspired against her, Elizabeth fell prey to a vicious postpartum infection. The once vibrant Queen, a symbol of unity and hope, faded with each passing day. The 11th of February dawned, a day etched in sorrow. Elizabeth of York, on her 37th birthday, succumbed to the relentless grip of illness. The news shattered the fragile peace of the court. Grief, raw and profound, engulfed the king and their children. Biographers recount the utter devastation that consumed Henry VII, a man known for his stoicism and political prowess. He was reduced to a state of despair. He retreated, seeking solace in solitude, a stark contrast to his usual composure. This outward display of vulnerability was a testament to the depth of Henry's love for Elizabeth. Court records reveal a further sign of his distress. After Elizabeth's death, the king became inexplicably ill himself. He refused the ministrations of doctors, seeking only the comfort of his mother. This unprecedented behaviour fueled anxieties within the court. A king who readily showed weakness and shunned medical attention was a recipe for instability. A newly discovered illuminated manuscript offers a poignant glimpse into the aftermath of Elizabeth's death. The image depicts a grief-stricken Henry, cloaked in mourning attire, receiving the book. Behind him stand his daughters Mary and Margaret, their faces veiled in black. In the foreground, a young Prince Henry, barely 11 years old, weeps inconsolably into the empty bed of his mother. The stark contrast between the king's despair and the innocent heartbreak of his son paints a vivid picture of the family's anguish. Henry, though devastated, explored the possibility of remarrying, seeking to solidify alliances through political unions. However, the specifications that he outlined for a potential bride eerily mirrored Elizabeth's qualities. Perhaps deep down, he knew he could never truly replace the woman that held his heart. Elizabeth's death marked a turning point. The Tower of London, forever tainted by tragedy, was abandoned as a royal residence. The tradition of royal births within its walls ceased to exist. Furthermore, Henry's reputation for frugality seemed to intensify after Elizabeth's passing. Some saw it as a symptom of his grief, while others viewed it as a further sign of his detachment from the world. The years that followed were marked by remembrance. Every year on the anniversary of Elizabeth's death, a requiem mass was sung, bells tolled, and 100 candles were lit in her honour. Her minstrels continued to perform at court, a bittersweet reminder of a life cut short. The Queen lay in state within the Tower's St. Peter and Vicula Chapel. Her ladies-in-waiting, their faces etched with grief, held a mournful vigil. The flickering candlelight cast an ethereal glow upon the casket, highlighting the stillness that had replaced the vibrancy of a young queen. The funeral procession was a grand affair, a public display of mourning for a beloved queen. The streets of London were lined with grieving subjects, their heads bowed as the sombre procession passed. The once joyous bells of Westminster Abbey now tolled a mournful peal, a sorrowful soundtrack to a life cut short. Elizabeth of York's final days within the Tower of London were a stark contrast to the life that she might have led. The death of the Queen not only plunged the royal family into mourning, but also marked a turning point in English history. Her legacy, however, lived on, in the grief-stricken heart of the King and the continued traditions honouring her memory. Elizabeth of York remained a powerful presence, even in death. Henry VII was buried with Elizabeth of York under their effigies in his Westminster Abbey chapel. Her tomb was opened in the 19th century, and the wood casing of her lead coffin was found to have been removed to create space for the interment of her great-great-grandson, James VI. Welcome to Past People. Please subscribe to support these videos. The death of Queen Jane Seymour. The tragic and startling demise of Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's favoured consort, remains a subject of intrigue and debate. Jane Seymour, the third wife of the notorious Tudor monarch Henry VIII, is often characterised as his favourite, primarily due to her accomplishment of providing him with a much-desired male heir, who was expected to continue the Tudor dynasty. Nevertheless, the veracity of this assertion is subject to dispute. Shortly after Jane Seymour's passing at Hampton Court, Henry VIII was already engaged in discussions about his potential fourth wife, prompting questions about the circumstances surrounding her untimely death. The prevailing belief is that Jane Seymour succumbed to complications stemming from childbirth as she gave birth to the future King Edward VI. Childbirth during the Tudor era was fraught with peril and posed significant risk to women, making it more common than one might imagine for women to endure considerable suffering during the process. A particularly intriguing account regarding the birth of Edward VI comes from Nicholas Sander, a Catholic writer who held no particular fondness for King Henry. Sander asserted that Jane Seymour endured a grueling and challenging childbirth, with her limbs stretched to facilitate the passage for the child. Some accounts even suggested that her womb was cut open before her death to quicken the birth. During this arduous ordeal, a critical decision had to be made regarding whose life would be spared, the child's or the Queen's. In response, King Henry reportedly declared that the boy's life should be preserved, as he could easily secure another wife for himself. While there is no concrete evidence to support the notion that Jane Seymour underwent a caesarean section for childbirth, as there were no records of such a procedure before the 1580s, it is worth noting that Jane would have received the best available medical care in the country. If she did indeed undergo a caesarean section, her passing would have been likely excruciating. However, it is essential to acknowledge that safe caesarean sections for women did not become commonplace until the 20th century. There exists some persistent historical evidence suggesting that Jane Seymour might have experienced a unique birthing process. In 1643, Sir Richard Baker speculated that Jane endured an excruciating labour lasting 6 days or more. According to this account, she beseeched for her stomach to be incised to save the child and relieve her suffering. Additionally, there have been mentions of Jane Seymour suffering from postpartum fever or an infection as a result of childbirth. However, it's crucial to note that there are no sources or medical records corroborating these claims. By scrutinising the sequence of events surrounding Jane Seymour's labour and subsequent demise, several reported causes of her death came to light. It is documented that Jane went into labour sometime in the afternoon of October 9, 1537, and her son Edward was born around 2 a.m. on October 12th. She reportedly signed letters announcing the birth, and by 15th of October was sitting up in bed at Hampton Court, where guests attended the christening of her son. These details rule out the possibility of a caesarean section, as she would have required ample time for recovery. It wasn't until 4 days after Edward's birth that Jane Seymour's health began to deteriorate. Her chaplain and physicians described her initial symptoms as a natural postpartum fatigue, which she appeared to overcome and even improved upon. However, on Friday the 19th of October, it was reported that Jane was unwell once more, and her condition worsened over the weekend. By Monday, it was evident that Jane's health was in grave jeopardy. On Tuesday, Henry VIII was urgently summoned to her bedside at Hampton Court, where he prayed with her and remained by her side for a considerable period of time. It was evident to everyone that Jane Seymour was approaching the end of her life. On the 24th of October 1537, at 2 a.m. in the morning, Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, passed away within the confines of Hampton Court Palace. Initially, her death and the severe illness leading to it were attributed to the negligence of those attending to her, allowing her to be exposed to great cold and consume foods that her condition did not warrant. The sole written record pertaining to Jane's illness suggested the possibility of food poisoning or an upset stomach that caused her distress. There is also mention of her falling victim to a severe cold that ultimately led to her demise. During the Tudor period, colds and health issues were commonplace. And given the vulnerability that often follows childbirth, it is plausible that Jane was merely more susceptible. Although sepsis or fever were not explicitly mentioned at the time, it is conceivable that Jane Seymour may have succumbed to blood poisoning or sepsis. Alison Ware, along with 4 medical professionals, expressed skepticism regarding fever being the sole cause of Jane's death. They concluded that Jane likely died from a combination of factors, as she was documented hosting guests after the christening and indulging in rich food. It seems improbable that she developed postnatal fever at this juncture. Dehydration and a potential embolism leading to heart failure are also posited as contributing factors to Jane Seymour's passing. Hampton Court Palace held significant importance in Jane Seymour's life, as it was her residence where she spent considerable time. She undertook renovations, erasing traces of Anne Boleyn's presence, and tragically it was also the place where she breathed her last breath. After her demise, Henry VIII retreated to Windsor for a period of mourning. On the 1st of November 1537, Henry VIII made the decision for Jane Seymour to be laid to rest with haste in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Her burial was scheduled for the 12th of November, and the royal court was instructed to wear mourning attire. It is believed that Henry VIII may have donned purple, while everyone else wore black, signifying his unique mourning attire. Henry VIII delegated the funeral arrangements, specifying only the date and the location. The Duke of Norfolk was entrusted with organising a suitable procession to transport Jane's remains from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle. Although Henry usually took a keen interest in such ceremonies, he did not personally attend the funeral, in accordance with custom. Jane Seymour's passing was significant because she was the first Queen of England to die while she was in favour of the King since Henry VIII's mother, Elizabeth of York. Due to this, the Duke of Norfolk had to research the appropriate protocols for her funeral, taking inspiration from Elizabeth's funeral, which included a considerable number of earls, barons and knights. Norfolk ordered 200 masses to be sung for the repose of Jane's soul. Following this, Jane's body was embalmed and her entrails, including her heart, were surgically removed and interred separately in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, beneath the high altar. She was adorned in a golden robe with jewels, and a crown was placed upon her head. Her body lay in state for several days, during which masses were continuously conducted for her soul. The funeral procession made its way to Windsor, with Jane's stepdaughter Mary serving as the chief mourner, draped in black velvet and riding on horseback. She was accompanied by 29 mourners, one for each year of Jane's life. A lifelike effigy of Jane was also carried during the procession, as the solemn crowd watched the Queen's cortege pass in silence. On the 12th of November at 11 a.m., the procession reached Windsor. 6 pallbearers carried Jane's remains into St. George's Chapel, where they were met at the altar by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Prayers were offered as her body lay in state throughout the night, with Mary keeping vigil beside it. The following day a mass was conducted, and on the 12th of November a grand funeral ceremony unfolded, and Jane Seymour was interred with all the honours befitting a queen in a vault beneath the Garter Chapel. Her 2 brothers, Edward and Thomas, were in attendance, and as her coffin was lowered into the vault, the Queen's staff broke their staves of office and placed them in the grave to signify the conclusion of their service. For the next 6 hours the bells of London tolled, and 2 days later a mass was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, marking the conclusion of the Queen's funeral service. 9 years later, Henry VIII passed away and chose to be buried at Windsor Castle beside Jane Seymour. It is believed that Henry deeply loved Jane during their brief marriage, especially due to her gift of a long-awaited son. Jane Seymour's tragic death and subsequent burial marked a sombre chapter in Henry VIII's tumultuous love life. Thank you for watching and for your support. The last days of Katherine Parr. Katherine Parr became Queen of England and Ireland in a unique way. She was the last of King Henry VIII's 6 wives, ruling alongside him from their wedding on the 12th of July 1543 until his death on the 28th of January 1547. Catherine held the title of Queen Consort longer than any other wife of Henry VIII, and she even outlived him by over a year. Interestingly, Catherine holds a record for the most marriages among English queens. She had 4 husbands in total, and she achieved a remarkable feat for her time. She was the first woman in England to publish an original book in English under her own name. Shortly before the passing of Henry VIII, her husband, Henry made arrangements for Catherine's financial support, allocating £7,000 per year. He also stipulated that after his death, Catherine should receive the honours and treatment befitting a Queen of England. Following the coronation of her stepson Edward VI on the 31st of January 1547, Catherine withdrew from court and settled at her home in Old Manor, Chelsea. After Henry's demise, Catherine's former love interest and the new king's uncle, Thomas Seymour, returned to court. Catherine readily accepted Seymour's renewed proposal of marriage. However, knowing that it had only been 4 months since Henry's death, Seymour understood that the Regency Council would likely oppose their marriage at such an early stage. In late May, Catherine and Seymour married secretly. Their union remained undisclosed to King Edward VI and the council for several months, causing some scandal when it eventually came to light. Both the King and Lady Mary were displeased by the marriage. At 35 years old, Catherine found herself unexpectedly pregnant, which came as a surprise since she had not conceived during her previous 3 marriages. Around this time, Seymour began showing interest in Lady Elizabeth. There were rumours that Seymour had intentions to marry Elizabeth before Catherine, and it was later reported that Catherine caught them in an embrace. In June 1548, Catherine, accompanied by Lady Jane Grey, relocated to Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire. The Queen Dowager pledged to provide education for Lady Jane Grey, and it was there that Catherine spent the final months of her pregnancy and the last summer of her life. On the 30th of August 1548, Catherine gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Mary Seymour, in honour of Catherine's stepdaughter, Mary. Tragically, Catherine passed away on the 5th of September 1548 at Sudley Castle, likely due to childbed fever, a common illness stemming from poor hygiene during childbirth. The Queen took her last breath at Sudley Castle. Standing from one of the windows of the castle, your gaze sweeps across the manicured gardens, the vibrant hues a stark contrast to the stillness that would have hung heavy in the air that day. Perhaps you imagine a flicker of movement, a flash of silk catching the sunlight as Katherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, disappears behind a hedge. But such visions offer a fleeting glimpse into a life cut tragically short. For within these walls a shadow fell upon Katherine, a darkness that would extinguish the vibrancy of her days. The joy of childbirth, with the arrival of their daughter Mary on the 31st of August 1548, was quickly eclipsed by a chilling reality. Katherine succumbed to the dreaded puerperal fever, a merciless illness that lurked in the shadows of childbirth in the 16th century. Unlike today, where antibiotics offer a shield against such infections, the cause of the fever remained a mystery. It was a silent enemy, striking with a vengeance. The initial 3 days offered a false sense of security, only to be shattered by a sudden onset of chills, a pounding headache, and a bone-chilling cold. This swiftly transformed into a feverish inferno, leaving Katherine parched and drenched in sweat. The relentless torment soon shifted to the core of her being. A dull ache in her abdomen morphed into a searing agony. A relentless assault that stole her breath and stole her sleep. Any flicker of hope that this might be a fleeting discomfort was extinguished as her belly swelled, a grotesque parody of childbirth. The attendant physician, powerless against an unseen enemy, could only offer meagre comfort. The infection, unchecked, ravaged her body like a wildfire. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching silence. Weakness draped itself over, leaving her listless and indifferent, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman that she once was. And the telltale signs of death painted themselves across her face, a tongue, once vibrant, now coated in a sickly white, and a vacant stare that spoke volumes of the internal battle raging within. The struggle for breath became a desperate fight, punctuated by bouts of nausea and the indignity of uncontrollable diarrhea and painful urination. In the face of death, even the most basic bodily functions turned into a cruel betrayal. For 5 agonizing days, Katherine battled the relentless tide of infection, but the human body, no match for such a merciless foe, began to succumb. One by one, her organs faltered, overwhelmed by the relentless assault. In the early hours of the 5th of September 1548, the silence in the chamber deepened, a chilling testament to the final victory of fever. The vibrant queen, the woman who navigated the treacherous court of Henry VIII, lay still, a victim of a silent enemy. The aftermath was a muted affair. Katherine's body was wrapped in cerecloths, a rudimentary embalming technique surprisingly effective in preserving her remains. A ceremony steeped in the Protestant faith she passionately embraced saw her laid to rest in a nearby chapel. It was a simple affair, conducted in English, a remarkable departure from tradition and a testament to her unwavering beliefs. With this act, Katherine became the first English queen to receive a Protestant burial. Encased in her lead coffin, Katherine lay undisturbed for years as seasons turned and dynasties shifted. Her husband, Thomas Seymour, met a similar fate just months later, executed for treason. Little Mary Seymour faded from historical records, her fate shrouded in mystery. Slowly, those who loved Katherine, her siblings, friends, and family, succumbed to the passage of time, their stories swallowed by the relentless march of history. Standing by the window now, the vibrant gardens offer a poignant counterpoint to the tragedy that unfolded within those walls. Though the echoes of Katherine's footsteps may have faded, her story remains. A stark reminder of the fragility of life and the unwavering strength of human spirit in the face of the unknown. The death of Princess Charlotte. Princess Charlotte of Wales was one of the most loved royals of all time, but she never became the queen that the whole of Britain wished for. At only 21 years old, She died during the childbirth of her first child and son. The British public were dumbfounded by her tragic death, and her absence left a footnote in history. King George IV and his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, had their only child, Princess Charlotte, in 1796. She had been conceived almost immediately after the wedding, perhaps when their marriage was consummated on their wedding night. The relationship between her parents made her own relationships with her parents difficult, as she struggled to know who to side with and when. As a child, she grew up in her own household, made up of governesses and servants, and neither of her parents lived with her. Her childhood was plagued by loneliness due to the absence of a loving relationship with either of her parents. Her mother and father visited very rarely, and they were almost strangers to her. Her father wanted to keep her away from the public eye and the court, despite her desire, as she grew older, to take part in it. Her father is alleged to have been jealous of the young princess's popularity, as she was often cheered enthusiastically by the crowds when she was allowed to make an appearance. This was something he was not privy to himself. Her father was trying to keep Charlotte away from the throne that she was entitled to rule over one day by arranging a marriage that would keep her away from her country for months on end. The suitor he chose was Prince of Orange, whose native country was Holland, and he required a bride that could live there. Charlotte outright refused the match, refused to leave her beloved Britain. Her grandmother helped Princess Charlotte call off the engagement, and she eventually found happiness with a man of her choosing, the gorgeous Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. The public were overjoyed that their princess and future monarch would be staying in Britain, and that she had found her own happiness away from the toxic relationship with her parents. The British people pinned all their hopes and happiness on the Princess Charlotte becoming the future queen, because she was so much more popular than her father. The married couple moved into Claremont House in Asher, Surrey, and they spent all of their time together. They were passionately in love, and their wedding and marriage was followed by an announcement of her pregnancy in April 1817, and the public were overjoyed by the happy news. Unfortunately, the moment that should have been the happiest event in their lives became overcome with tragedy. In the late autumn month of November, in the year 1817, the much-loved Princess Charlotte was in labour with her firstborn child. This child would be the third in line to the throne, making this event a pinnacle one that the British public awaited the news with bated breath. Having already suffered from 2 miscarriages, the birth of this baby boy would have been all the more looked forward to, but the medical care and knowledge 200 years ago was a dangerous task. The baby was expected to have been born in October, but the princess was overdue, and the labour did not start until early November in 1817. A gruelling 50-hour labour commenced across a period of 2 days and 2 nights. She was accompanied by the best medical team, led by Sir Richard Croft, as well as a male midwife that was on hand to assist in the delivery. The princess was in agonising pain, and her contractions seemed to be doing very little to bring this life into the world. It was thought that the medical team may need to intervene to bring the baby earthside, but this idea was abandoned when the labour seemed to be progressing well again. The labour had been so long and gruelling, it is likely that the poor baby went into distress, and when he was born at the large size of 9 pounds, he was indeed stillborn. He had died during labour, but once born, the team did try to revive the infant. They began with chest compressions before trying to plunge it in warm water and other strange things like rubbing it with mustard before plying it with brandy. All attempts to revive the child failed. The nurses wrapped the poor babe in a shawl, and with tears in their eyes they presented the infant to the ministers. Perhaps in shock and just glad to be over with the grueling labour, Princess Charlotte took the baby loss without showing emotion. She was obviously exhausted and hungry after not eating for 2 days, so she was given a tray of freshly cooked chicken, broth and toast. This nonchalant behaviour made what came next all the more devastating. The princess complained of feeling sick and having ringing in her ears. She became restless and breathless with severe abdominal pain before turning cold to the touch. The doctor began to panic and the room's atmosphere turned frantic. They tried to warm up the young princess with hot flannels and water bottles, as well as giving her 20 drops of laudanum in wine and water. Little was known about the complications of childbirth and how to cure it, and so the doctors had run out of all options. At only 21 years old, at 2:30 a.m., on Thursday the 6th of November, Princess Charlotte died. The medical professionals can only assume the causes of the young princess's death, and conditions that have been thrown around since include that of an embolism, postpartum hemorrhage, or postpartum preeclampsia, or a rare metabolic blood disorder. The poet Lord Byron heard the dread news in Venice, and his reaction was severely distressed when he uttered an anguished scream that echoed over the Grand Canal. The death of the Princess Charlotte has been a shock even here, and must have been an earthquake at home, he wrote to a friend. She was really loved by all, and the outpouring of public grief reflected their love for their beloved princess. One contemporary later wrote, "It really was as if every household throughout Great Britain had lost a favourite child." Most of the churches across the country held a service to memorialise her. Shops were forced to close in respect of the public mourning, and they remained shut for 2 weeks. Public buildings were also draped with black. The nation was full of grief that quickly turned from sadness to pure anger, and they were on a quest for someone to blame. The man at the centre of their blame was the midwife Sir Richard Croft, who had made the decision not to intervene with forceps, as well as the silly restrictive diet he had prescribed the princess. He was not blamed by the devastated husband of Charlotte, but despite this he went on to take his own life, perhaps ridden with guilt over the princess and her child's death. He took a pistol to his head just 3 months after the tragedy. A fundraiser was started so that a memorial could be built to commemorate her life. A marble memorial was built at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where it still stands today, a testament to the affection in which Charlotte was held. Charlotte and the infant were buried by night at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 19th of November 1817, in an eerie state funeral.